ask you about your relationship to the cage.
The cage?
Yeah, you know, where we put people. Millions, in fact.
Oh, you mean jail?
Prison, detention center, correctional facility, whatever you'd like to call it.
What about it?
Does it help you sleep at night? My first case inside a detention center didn't go as planned. It was August 2016, 2 years after I graduated from law school. I was studying for comprehensive exams as a graduate student in the PhD program, and I got a call from a friend who said someone in detention was having their final hearing, so I went to see her. At the detention center, I met with her a week before her hearing and decided to file a motion to continue because her case was so complex. During the hearing, the judge walked in, she sized me up, and she said she was going to give me some advice off the record. At first, I was glad because I thought she was being genuine. I had never tried an immigration case in court before, and I thought the judge sensed that. But she ended up giving me some rather strange words of advice. She said, "No one case is worth your license."
How did you react?
I didn't know how to react. I didn't really understand what was happening. And so I asked her if she got the motion, and she said, "Well, we're going back on record and motion denied."
What happened then?
The judge asked if I was ready to proceed with the asylum case, and I couldn't in good faith take on the case because I hadn't even seen the full file yet. I only met her a week ago. So I told her I couldn't take on her asylum case at that moment. That's why we asked for more time. But yeah, she said, if you're not ready to proceed, then you're dismissed.
Dismissed you?
Yeah, she told me to leave so they can proceed with the case.
Did you leave?
I almost did, but I thought I would take a chance and ask if I could stay in the courtroom.
What happened with the case?
The ICE attorney and the judge took turns grilling her. At one point, the judge asked her, "Other than being your daughter's mother, why would your removal to Mexico result in exceptional and unusual hardship for your daughter?" The hearing lasted 3 hours. After that, the judge ordered her deported.
And what did you do?
I went home and cried.
I think a turning moment in the class was when students saw the documentary Immigrants for Sale, this brief documentary that looks at the role of profits in the private immigrant detention industry, and they really honed in on that. We also visited one of the detention facilities, and that was very eye-opening for people. So this is just a great deal of the brainstorming. It was taking this vast issue, and sometimes a very intimidating issue, and trying to hone down right into this single panel, this single thing in about this much of space that people would encounter, and how to convey one simple message to them. I think one of the strengths of this exhibit is that it places local stories of incarceration in a bigger context. So the big issue it's grappling with is, why have we had this massive rise in incarceration in the United States since about the 1970s? And the exhibit highlights this in a timeline on the wall that really shows how numbers have grown, right, since that time. But it really grounds it by exploring this issue through local stories, through different periods of history. So students went out in different sites, just like my students did here, and examined a question that was of interest to them, a nearby facility, a prison in their backyard, right? And through the lenses of all those local stories, we can get a much richer sense of the bigger picture. I think another strength is that it puts immigrant detention and general incarceration into conversation with one another. It looks at them as part of the same process.
So for the 3 hours that I sat in the courtroom that day, it cemented for me the process of the differences between essentially what I argue is policy and reality. It's a discrepancy that I hadn't thought about before. You don't have to necessarily think about the practical implications until you're in a detention center and you think about these rights-based models, and then you see it kind of work out in practice.
By looking at all of U.S. immigration history through the lens of detention, 3 phases appear. First, from 1891 until 1954, detention is premised on exclusionary motivations. Then, in 1954, after a change in policy away from de facto detentions, there is official government rhetoric creating a period of, quote, humane detentions. Finally, in 1981, policy changes again, so detentions are premised on deterrence, or simply violence.
So if you think about why people are detained in the first half of the 20th century, it's for exclusionary purposes. And this list of exclusionary groups or categories grows over time. And eventually, national origins quotas are added in the 1920s. So people are essentially detained to determine if they met one of the exclusion categories and or if they exceeded a given quota for that year. In order to understand the experiences of the detained, I looked at already existing oral histories, common themes like anxiety, fear, hopelessness start to appear over and over again. Eventually, these themes manifest themselves in a very real way through reports of suicides. According to one government estimate, there were 3,000 suicides at Ellis Island in its first 40 years of operation. So there are also dozens of reported cases of suicides at Angel Island, and looking through some of the oral histories, we find the same types of fears and anxieties that people faced. They ask, what were your first impressions of Angel Island in this particular interview? And the person who was detained says, quote, it wasn't too much to begin with, but I was told certain parts. Going to the latrine at night was kind of scary because they say ghosts, you know, and he chuckles. People there hung themselves and all that stuff. That was scary. I was afraid to get out of bed at night. So it seemed that while policy was premised on exclusionary motivations, the reality for many was something far harsher. In thinking about the detention regime today, policy is no longer premised on exclusion. So my next question was, so when did this policy change? The answer goes back to Ellis Island. In 1954, after public outcry, Ellis Island closed down.
A purported new era operating within a Cold War rhetorical framework began with a detention policy favoring parole. After decades of detaining non-citizens at Ellis Island, Angel Island from 1910 to 1940, and other facilities across the country, most non-citizens were to be paroled instead of detained during the course of their administrative proceedings. The then Attorney General Herbert Brownell declared that only those who were deemed a flight risk or national security threat or public safety concern would be detained, and everyone else would be released on parole. And he called this policy humane. And in his estimate, he said that less than 1,000 people would be detained in any given year. So what's actually going on? Was this merely Cold War rhetoric? Because prominent detention centers did close down. While official policy was saying that things were now humane, the reality on the ground was very different. To understand this reality, I traced the numbers. If local and county jails were housing immigration prisoners throughout the late 1950s into the 70s, then they must have been paid by the federal government to do so. To trace the money, I went looking for county records at the state archives in Phoenix.
Sure, here we have a register of immigration prisoners. There's not much background information within the actual document, but you can kind of tell that these were immigrants that were, I guess, rounded up during raids in the 1950s. You can tell that they were just imprisoned for a couple of days and then released. Some of them were actually sent to the U.S. Marshals. I think this is the only one that we have of these because back in the 1990s or so, it happened quite a while ago, either one of two things happened. Either they were running out of space or the retention schedule didn't say that these were permanent. Either way, they started getting rid of a lot of stuff. And at that time, the state archivist at the time was worried that we weren't getting everything from Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. So under cover of night, a few of the archivists went and they went into the dumpsters, if you will, got in there, went through all the trash, and they found a few volumes like this. I don't know how many times they did this, but I think it was only a couple of times. But we did save some artifacts from being thrown away, but unfortunately, who knows how long this process was going on. So this is the only immigration prisoner book that we have. Federal prisoners held in county jails, state jails, would have to, of course, be fed and clothed and things like that. And those expenses are supposed to be picked up by the federal government. So the Board of Supervisors, who's in charge of these counties for all the expenses for all these institutions, would have charged them an expected payment, and therefore they would be put into the minutes of their report of their meetings. This is a very little used reference that can actually be used in greater effect if you're looking, if you're doing some sort of quantitative history, or if you're trying to get at what's not being said in the official reports.
by looking at the Board of Supervisor minutes for various counties across Arizona, we can see how the federal revenue brought in through housing federal prisoners was then used to further expand jail and prison facilities. This revenue making was taking place for much of the 20th century. By tracing the money to these jails, we can also see the conditions people were subjected to, and thereby attempt to understand the reality of their experiences.
In 1954 was also the year when the government had built camps across the country based on a law passed 4 years earlier. The Emergency Detention Act of 1950 had authorized the Attorney General to arrest and detain each person as to whom there is reasonable cause to believe that such person probably will engage in or probably will conspire with others to engage in acts of espionage or sabotage during internal security emergencies. The law was eventually repealed in 1971.
Scholars early on in the 1970s pointed to Chile in 1973 after the coup of General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected president Salvador Allende as one of the first moments of the implementation of neoliberal capitalism as unrestrained free market, classical capitalism unrestrained by state regulation or forces being implemented quite literally on army tanks and the bayonets of the Chilean military as they tortured and disappeared thousands of people in Chile. You had a similar implementation of this economic project in other places of Latin America that depended on state violence and military authoritarianism, but not quite as neat, if I can use that word, to describe what happened in Augusto Pinochet's Chile. The other way that we have the onset of neoliberal capitalism and the reorganization of both the economy and society in Latin America occurs with the 1982 debt crisis. And this really begins with Mexico in 1982 defaulting. At the time, it was the biggest default on its foreign debt. In Mexico, the way this evolves throughout the 1980s after this debt crisis of 82 is you had the dismantling of a welfare state that had been built since the 1920s, 1930s, since basically building off the legacy of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. So throughout the 1980s, you had the dismantling of state-owned companies, you had cutbacks in social spending, essentially you had the implementation of austerity. So poor people, people in the countryside, urban workers, and many members of the Mexican urban middle class ended up paying for this structural realignment of the Mexican economy, as U.S.-based economists term this change, right? And in neoliberal capitalism, what it entailed was essentially the plundering of the country for the advantage of a very small transnational financial and economic elite. For one example is, one famous example is Carlos Slim, right? One of the wealthiest men in the world. He had been a person with political connections in Mexico, and really one of the foundations of his immense wealth that he has now was being able to buy the state-owned telecommunications company Telmex in questionable circumstances in terms of how he got access to being able to purchase this state-owned telecommunications company. So what you had before was a state monopoly over telecommunications, over landlines, phone lines, becomes a private monopoly owned by one man. And really he builds this immense fortune off of that. And that gets repeated over and over again in Mexico in the late 80s, specifically when you had the no-bid sales of state-owned companies to politically connected private capitalists. Of course, this culminates with the successful negotiation in 1992 of the North American Free Trade Agreement, right, which integrated economically the Canadian, U.S., and Mexican economies quite unfairly, hierarchically, right? They're still fighting over it to this day how some of the economic integration of these economies, obviously with Trump now, he's throwing a wrench into this so-called free trade arrangement. What this ends up doing, and with the 80s, with the economic crisis the 80s did in Mexico, and then the onset of NAFTA in the 90s, one of the products was increased immigration to the United States.
Detention policy formally changed again in 1981 when the then Attorney General William French Smith said the detention of aliens seeking asylum was necessary to discourage people like the Haitians from setting sail in the first place. So detention policy became premised on deterrence. Starting in the 1980s, people were held in detention to both deter future border crossers and to break the will of those held inside. So essentially the government was saying, we're going to make this so difficult for you that you, quote, give up and go home. That is essentially still the policy today.
So at the same time that you have the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which ostensibly gives free circulation of capital across national borders, you also have a hardening, a physical hardening of those national borders to prevent people in Mexico whose livelihoods are being decimated by free trade from allowing them to come into the United States. So you have this weird conflict in which capital and goods will be allowed to freely circulate across borders, but people in Mexico whose lives are being drastically affected for the negative by this so-called free trade agreement are not allowed to come into the United States freely to seek a better life, to seek a better economic life. So for me, the way I read NAFTA transnationally is, on the one hand, you have these famous images of Mexican, US, and Canadian officials signing NAFTA in 1992, 1993. But the underside to that is Operation Gatekeeper and the hardening of the border and the expanding of border enforcement that happened in 1994 and 1995 with Bill Clinton. So you have this weird but totally logical conflict between the free circulation of capital, the free circulation of commodities, but you will not allow people to cross into the United States to seek a better economic life. And this is really when we get the plan, I think, from the United States side to build up border enforcements around major urban centers along the border, and therefore force migrants who are trying to come into the United States to cross through dangerous areas like the Sonora Desert in Arizona. And not surprisingly, we have a spike in hundreds of migrant deaths in the Arizona desert.
One of the camps built in 1954 was in Florence. The camp became a minimum security federal jail for prisoners awaiting trial. Then, in the early 1960s, the Bureau of Prisons built a new maximum security facility there. Eventually, the BOP transferred their detention center about a mile south of Florence Gardens to the INS.
During the era of violent detentions, Cubans detained at the INS facility destroyed it in protest of prolonged and indefinite detentions. The riot would be quelled and the facility was rebuilt. That rebuilt facility still functions as a service processing center today.
I moved to Florence probably about 31 years ago. And so in 2004, two council people that were on that current council stepped down, so they had 2 vacant seats. So I applied for one of the vacant seats, and I think they had 9 or 10 people that applied. So I was one of the 2 that was selected to fill the vacant seat in 2004. And of course, I was the first Black person that ever sat on this town council in Florence. Yeah, which is pretty sad, 2004, and there had never been a Black person on the council. But needless to say, that's another story. But years ago, the prison was, I think, originally in Yuma, and they didn't want it anymore. So they actually had inmates to build the prison, the first portion of the prison here in Florence, which is like the central unit. So that was actually the one that they had in Yuma. It's built here for the prison. So it kind of became a prison town. I don't know that they wanted that to be the focus of the town, but it just kind of evolved into that. And they have, of course, subsequently built a lot more prisons since then.
And how then is the relationship between the city and those running the prisons? I mean, some are state-run and some are like private run.
Yeah, some are private and some are state.
Is there a difference you see between how they run, or just with the city it's all kind of the same?
You know what, they're kind of their own little communities, so we don't have a lot of involvement. We don't have any say in how they run their facilities, as long as they're doing it per their state laws and guidelines. So we're kind of separate entities, but we have working relationships, and they should be better, and we're going to try to improve them so that we can be beneficial for both the town and their facilities. But they do their own thing per se, because they're their own community or entity, separate from ours, although they do have to follow the town procedures and guidelines. But we don't get to tell them what to do in their facilities, and they don't get to tell us how to run our town. So prisons are the private prisons. Prisons, you know, I think because they've been here for so long, it's just part of the town. And actually, you don't even want, when you hear, because they're all on the other side of the highway, so they're their own little entity. Unless something goes on over there major, you don't really even think about it. So I don't really think it's a big deal for people who have been here forever, because the prisons were, most of them were here probably before they came. And so it's not a big deal for people. And a lot of people move here knowing the prisons are here, so.
And they would feel the same way whether it's private or public.
Yeah, I don't know that they put a lot of thought into it. And a lot of people aren't aware of how private prisons work either, I don't think, because they don't really publicize that. So I think if more people knew how the system worked, they might be a little more upset about it. But people just have different perspectives, and the prisons do afford us some extra economy because we get to count them in our population, so we do get state share revenues for them. But at the same time, we also do provide some services that doesn't balance out to what we have to do for people that are not behind our gated community. But we do have to provide services. If they have a fire department goes there, our police go there if they call out for service. So there's a level of service that we provide for them, but it's probably not as much. So, but there is some benefit from having prisons in your town. financial benefit.
Would you see more prisons coming to town? Or?
I don't really want to see more prisons, and I really don't like the private prisons, but they're here. But I really like to see the state do away with private prisons because I don't think they serve their useful purpose. And even prisons have gotten away from rehabilitating people. They've just become a big money-making business, and I would really like to see us do away with those private prisons. But no, I don't want to see more prisons here. We have enough.
So this idea or this actual practice of housing migrant detainees or refugee detainees in privately owned prisons, to me, and we've talked about this before, to me this is an instance of how the actual bodies of migrants and refugees, their actual occupation of a cell and a bed in a privately owned prison produces capital, produces value for that private corporation that owns and runs a prison. If you look at that within a longer scale of, like, for instance, a Mexican migration to the US since the 19th century, right? It was the actual labor, the work that these migrants could do that was actually what was valued by US capitalists that were employing them in mines and railroads and assorting agricultural fields, right? But now it's not even the labor of migrants that private companies seek to exploit. Right? It's the actual bodies, the actual ability of these migrants to live without any sort of rights in privately owned prisons, sleeping on these privatized beds, sleeping in these privatized cells.
That year, we saw the passing of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which was purported to be the largest crime bill in the history of the country, and would provide for 100,000 new police officers, $9.7 billion in funding for prisons, and $6.1 billion in funding for prevention programs that were designed with significant input from experienced police officers. 1994 was also the year when the U.S. prison population topped 1 million people for the first time in the country's history. In Arizona, 1994 proved significant for another reason. It was the year when the first private prison opened in the state. In the fall of 1991, the Bureau of Prisons requested proposals. They wanted to build a 1,000-inmate medium security facility. There were 3 sites that were being considered: Eloy, Casa Grande, and Quartzsite. Quartzsite wins the bid. However, the Eloy mayor, as well as CCA, who was bidding for the Casa Grande site, appealed that decision. Once that appeal went through, the Quartzsite contract was canceled. Eloy won the bid. Eloy's facility, the Eloy Detention Center, opened in July 1994. 500 beds for the INS and 500 beds for the Bureau of Prisons. The price per prisoner per day was $4. Right after it opened, there were several riots that took place, once in October and another time in November. Eventually, a warden was brought in to quiet the situation. At the same time, at a cost of about $17 million, another detention center, the Central Arizona Detention Center, was built in Florence. This CCA-run prison was meant to help the U.S. Marshal house prisoners in a facility that was not an overcrowded county jail.
No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. Injusticia, no injusticia, no.
The reason why we're here is because we're trying to get ICE. We're trying to end collaboration between ICE and 4th Ave, right? So there's, today's the International Workers' Day, right? And a lot of our families are workers, a lot of our families are immigrant workers, and also, a lot of them are being detained at 4th Ave, and they're being criminalized, right? So before we can continue on doing other work, we need to handle this.
Well, I'm a social worker here in Phoenix, getting my MSW, and so work with Latino immigrant families, for about the last 6 years, and just based on the lived experiences of my clients and people that I know on both sides of the border, of the policies and the practices of immigration detention and deportation are really harmful to the communities, all the way from the individual to the community level. And so I'm just here to voice my opinion as a social worker and just as a human being.
So the strange thing about detention is it is so huge and yet so hidden. Here in this state of Arizona, we have, a number of facilities that are just about an hour away from Phoenix. Large metropolitan area. But you would never know it if you didn't have a personal connection to these places. And I sense that even some people living in those communities have very little awareness of what goes on inside the facilities. Okay? So it's easy to be very distant from that. But if you have a relative, if you have a friend, if you know someone who's been detained, you're going to have a very real sense of the horror of that issue. And I believe that detention, it's easy for us to see it as just an administrative thing that has to do with immigration policy and kind of the practical politics of enforcing our country's borders and keeping everything in order. But if you know someone who's been personally detained, right, whether they're your relative or your friend or you've just met them and talked with them, broken bread with them over a table, then you know that detention is traumatic. It is traumatizing. It's unjust. So I've learned that through my volunteer experience. Before I started on this project, before I started in this class, I would take women into my home who had been detained and had to wait maybe 24 or 48 hours until they got a bus ticket to another state, share food with them. And I remember a couple of women telling me when I made this chicken soup and some tortillas, well, we can't really eat much because our stomachs have shrunk because we haven't been eating well in detention. Or deciding to work on art all day. This piece of art right here is from a woman who asked me if I had any paper that she could borrow or any paints, and she made this beautiful weaving as they'd make in detention. But she didn't speak with me much, but I overheard her and the other woman I was hosting speak in hushed tones about someone who had taken their own life a few days ago. So even though that suicide did not, it wasn't their lives, that secondary sense of the trauma and the horror of it was very, very real.
The detention, the detainment, and the separation of migrant families, right? This is a form of state violence. And this form of state violence, to me, has always underscored what the U.S. political project for the last 200 and something years has depended on. It's just a state violence that's separate, that's maintained concealed, that's maintained away from everyday American lives in terms of what people are doing, proceeding, living out their lives. This is what the border region does. I mean, the border region functions as one of these sites where we can keep the type of violence that is necessary for the reproduction of U.S. democracy away from public view.
Mi nombre es Diana Ramos, soy del Salvador. Si al mencionar la palabra Eloy me causa como pánico, como miedo, mejor trato no mencionarlo, que cada día pensaba yo, ahora me voy, ahora voy a salir, porque cada día les pagan, cada día, y entre más tiempo esté uno, les pagan más. 4 años y 2 meses, que vienen siendo 50 meses, ¿cuánto no habrán recibido por mí?
For me, it goes back to the notion that we have processes going on that treat some human lives as more worthy of belonging, thriving, existing, being, than others. So these detention facilities exist in the name of protecting our nation's borders, in the name of protecting the youth of this country, youth of the United States, right, preserving a strong population here by keeping out unwanted people, those deemed dangerous. Okay, but what we're doing is we're deciding that some human lives are worth our care, worth our concern, and some are expendable. So it's violent, sometimes it is direct violence, sometimes you hear of people being abused by guards, put in solitary confinement where they're driven to desperation, and sometimes it's neglect, very gross neglect, neglect of medical care, neglect of really crucial psychological attention, okay? That causes people to be driven to a suicidal state or to fall into depression.
So I'm thinking if the pushback to that would be that the state can decide who's expendable because certain populations have violated the authority of the state by crossing into their territory. And within the jurisdiction of that territory, the state, whatever it does or doesn't, is up to the state.
So what I hear in that, I hear the common argument, well, they broke the law, right? What they're doing is illegal. And that's often the common thing. So shouldn't the state, in this case the US, be able to do whatever it needs to do to make sure that its laws are enforced? Okay? And I'd say on the one hand, the situation is much, much messier than a black and white legal-illegal question. We have many people who are seeking asylum, okay? So they're in process, they're in limbo, but they're going through legal procedures in order to seek inclusion. Okay? And I'd also say that that argument can be very, very scary if taken to an extreme, because we have the case now within our current administration in the US of the argument being made that if parents break the law by bringing their children here, then they should be separated from their children. So we have that extreme. So I think we just really have to look at what's the sacrifice that we're willing to make in human life, right, for the state to maintain its power. And for me, family separation, or putting any human being in a situation where they're driven to the despair of suicide, that's too high of a cost to pay. When I went down to volunteer in Ciudad Juarez at a women's shelter on the border, I did not have an opinion. Of course, I was 21 at the time. I didn't have a lot of thoughts about, many things, but I did not have a strong opinion on what US immigration policy, border policy should be. All I knew is I wanted to hear the stories of those who were most directly impacted. And it was through the course of that time, over about 2 years, in subsequent study, that I gradually came to see that a more open border policy would be the best, right? Even if I didn't know how to make that happen, I knew that the costs of maintaining borders as they are were too high. The human costs were too high. And I think I'm coming to that in my own research on incarceration, right? Came at it without, probably with more of a reformist agenda that we need to make things more humane. In the sense of immigrant detention, I thought that didn't need to exist at all. But I hadn't yet made the connection between that and mass incarceration. I thought, prisons are probably in general need to be hugely reformed and reduced, but maybe they're good for, a small amount of the population. But I have to say it's a kind of issue that the more you get to know people who are directly impacted by it, the more important it is to see things from that point of view and to question the whole system. So I'm leaning toward, yes, we need to envision a world without prisons, we need to work toward a world without prisons. It's a hard thing for me to do. Now, I was a granddaughter of a prison warden. My grandfather was the warden of Angola in Louisiana, and I was, remember going down and visiting in their house on the prison grounds while he was the warden there. I knew him as a very kind, gentle, fun guy. He always had a joke to tell, cigar in his mouth, and he was artistic. He loved to make photography. He invented his own species of flower that he crossbred, named it after my mother. He was a wonderful man, a very fascinating, educated man. And yet he supported the death penalty for the people who he thought were the worst and unredeemable. He supported a system that I'm not okay with. And I think, in thinking through this project, my own work on immigrant detention and where I came from, I reflect on the sense of importance I had as a little girl, being the granddaughter of that warden, Warden Blackburn. And the sense that I had that somewhere in the back of my mind, these awful systems, they're keeping us safe, right? They're keeping us okay. And I have to grapple with that when I think about immigrant detention. There's a little piece of me that still doesn't want to let go of the possibility that somehow our current immigration system is keeping things, a standard of living, a little bit better for the rest of us, those of us who are here, who are citizens, who are born here. Right? I fight against the system, and then there's that little part of me, that little nugget of fear that doesn't want to entirely let go. Right? But I can say working on this personally and engaging with people who've been directly impacted has forced me to confront that.
So thinking about this seemingly radical idea of abolishing prisons or reimagining what a post-carceral landscape would look like. I mean, as a historian, we have to remember that prisons in their current iterations haven't existed all that long in the longer scope of human history, right? Especially in the United States, right? Prisons have been around a little over 100 years, and they've emerged for very specific political, economic, and social reasons. I think thinking about a post-carceral world or country or community or landscape, however we want to term it, I think it's an entry point to get us to rethink questions of power. It forces us to rethink questions of policing, questions of, from my perspective as a historian of Mexico, questions of empire, right? So for instance, we look at the history of policing, right? And obviously the way that modern policing emerges in the US is twofold. One, as descendants of slave patrols, right? These slave patrols used in the South and in border states between the slave states and free states to prevent, patrol, to surveil the mobility of African American slaves. But also there's a counterinsurgent component, right? Modern policing, as people like Stuart Schrader have shown, really takes their cues also from US imperial adventures overseas, from the occupation of the Philippines in the late 19th, early 20th century, to the series of so-called banana wars that the US engaged in Latin America throughout the first 30, 35 years of the 20th century. Right? So if we think about, if we attack this question of imagining a country or a world without prisons, it forces us to go beyond that. It forces us to think about how we can reorganize our social and political lives in a way where we can truly create egalitarian communities for everyone. So it does seem like, especially in our times, in our dark times, I think a post-carceral landscape would necessarily entail a reimagining or rethinking or abolishing of things like police. We'd have to rethink questions of justice. We'd have to rethink questions of impunity. We'd have to reorient a bourgeois legal structure that punishes refugees who are seeking asylum, but the people who caused the 2008 financial crash are making billions, again, steering the economy toward another potential disaster. We have to rethink how to reorganize an economy to benefit all and not just remain the province of capital accumulation for a few at the top. Prisons and police and drug wars and crime wars, these are all methods of maintaining, in the US at least, social and racial control. They are methods of maintaining and perpetuating unequal racial capitalist systems. So if we start to at least rethink what a world or a country would look like without prisons, that would be an entry point into reimagining a better world that is possible. And we're getting to the point where it has to be done. Like our prison populations are unsustainable. It's obvious what police practices and carceral practices are doing in this country today. So maybe thinking about abolishing the police, abolishing ICE, abolishing DHS, abolishing prisons, those are all just critical starting points to reimagining a better world, a more egalitarian world. But first we have to say enough is enough, right? To take a quote from the Zapatistas, ya basta, enough is enough.